right, what's up everybody? Welcome back to Source ADV. I am Mark Jackson. In front of me, I've got a 2020 KTM 500 XCF-w. This is the most recent generation of the 500 XCF-w and has been the same for the last few years. And the idea that I'm trying to go for with this bike in this build is to make it into a bike that could do it all, right? The problem with adventure riding or single track riding or racing is that a lot of times the bikes have to be so different in order to accomplish each one of those goals that you end up kind of either needing a few different bikes or having one bike that's just so bad at something that it just makes you not want to do that thing. Well, I think this particular platform, the 500 XCF-w platform, is the perfect platform to have a bike that can do enduro riding, single track riding, racing, like actual racing, you know, like enduro racing, not motocross racing. Granted, I'm sure you could take this thing on the track if you change the suspension around. And then also do kind of lightweight adventure riding, you know, 5-day trips on the backcountry discovery routes, the Trans-America trails, anything like that where it's very off-road focused. In the past, I've usually had like an adventure bike, like a KTM 1090, or you've seen my Suzuki DRZ 400 build, or my 2017 500 EXCF build that kind of had a crazy rally tower. The problem with all those bikes is you can't ride them on single track. They are just impossible to actually have a really good time running single track very fast. Well, this bike, as it sits today, is a single track monster. It is completely dialed for single track. I can keep up with a lot of guys who are on 302 strokes, which is like supposed to be the single track slayer of all time. And you know, these are guys that are racers. You know, I ride primarily with B and A level riders, and this bike is not a limiting factor anymore. It's totally dialed to that style of riding. Now, the big question is, can we pull it back to also being able to do adventure riding without destroying that? So I've got this fantasy, right? That this bike can literally, with the right camping equipment, and it's already street legal, right? With a Moscow Reckless 54 luggage system, that I literally take this thing and ride it to an AMRA race. There's a few kind of close ones that are about 100 miles away or so, but you know, ride the bike to the race, camp off the bike, run the race, and then ride the bike back, which I think would be so much fun because it kind of reminds me of that Dakar Male Moto style where you have a suitcase that the crew brings with you. And if you haven't heard of Male Moto style, look it up. There's a guy named Lyndon Poskett that has done it a few times in the past and kind of documents it really well. It's a pretty cool format, but essentially like it's the closest thing to running the Dakar Rally off of your bike, you know, like kind of like almost running the Dakar Rally like an adventure. So I kind of want to do my own Male Moto version of the AMRA race series on this bike and see how that goes. So today, let's go over some of the things that have made this bike a single track slayer and an enduro racer. This thing will be going into an enduro race here in a few days in the AMRA series. I'll be running 30 plus because I'm 35 years old. I'll be running 30 plus B class, so it'll be really interesting to see where I place. So let's go through the bike. I'll give you a tour and get ready for this race. And then you have to subscribe to see the race and see how this thing does adventure riding. So what had to go into this bike to make it a single track slayer and capable of racing in the AMRA series here in Arizona? Well, I have a few mods on here that I think were the key mods to making this thing actually capable in a racing scenario. And the first thing that had to be dealt with was the suspension of the bike. The suspension on these 500 XCF-Ws or the 350 XCF-w or the comparable version of that Husqvarna as well is pretty soft in its stock format. It's definitely made for trail riding at slower speeds. When you start moving it at any speed that is closer to a racing speed or just even fast or spirited single track riding, the suspension starts to pack up and be way too far down in the stroke and you start to get really, really terrible things happening. So I chose to go to my buddy Warren over at EnduroSpec. And what he did was actually on the forks, swap out the whole cartridge of the fork and put in an MX Tech Lucky conversion. The Lucky fork is the closest thing to a works fork you can get without going directly to WP or one of those companies. And to be entirely honest, it handles awesome. It's definitely a little bit stiffer at very, very slow speeds. So if you're doing first gear crawling over rocks, you will notice a little bit more harshness. But as soon as you get the bike moving and keep it moving, everything smooths out. So those lucky inserts on the front fork were game changers for this bike. Whereas on the stock fork, I actually completely went over the bars on this bike, hitting something that was in shadows because I completely packed the rear, bottomed it out, and then literally went over the top of the bike in like my second ride. And that was because I was coming off of that YZ250X that EnduroSpec also did the suspension on that could just eat anything that you could just throw at it. The rear has been matched as well. It's got revalved and some other additional parts to make it pretty close to a works rear shock as well. That whole process and that whole buildup is not as expensive as you'd think. If you go to like a cone valve setup and a Trax rear shock, you're looking at close to $6,500 to make this bike handle in a lot of different scenarios. That's craziness. The other thing that's really cool about both of these setups is that now the adjustability of them is so much that if I'm going into a track or a trail that I know is really, really rocky, I'll take a few clicks out, make it a lot softer. If I'm going to something where I'm gonna be more in third and fourth gear and gonna be hitting a lot of, whoops and stuff, well, I'll just click it in a few times before the ride and make it stiffer. And that really does change. So that suspension modification is a huge, huge win to make this bike actually an enduro racing single track slayer. It's almost like a must do. So what else on a 500 XCF-w is really important? Well, I don't know if it's actually important because the bike actually is very usable off-road in a lot of different scenarios in single track and even racing in its stock form, but it will get really hot. So I chose to use a GET ECU, remove the reeds, desmog it, and put a Pro Moto billet end cap on the exhaust. We're working on a video right now about the Vortex ECU versus the GET ECU on this bike, so definitely subscribe for that. The combination of those modifications to the engine of this bike, it's insane. You literally have, with the map switch on the handlebars, 2 different bikes at your disposal. You have a power map, which basically turns this thing into a 450 XCF kind of closed course track bike. I've had one of those bikes, so I know the power band on them and what they feel like. This bike feels just like that in the power map, but it's possibly a little bit smoother down low, which is crazy to me. Wow, that over rev is so good. In the enduro map, the bike is the closest thing that I've ever felt a 4-stroke to being like a 300 2-stroke. A 300 2-stroke or even a 250 XCW is infamous for being kind of almost unstallable in slow speed scenarios. This bike is not unstallable. Like, you can definitely stall it if you really try it, but if you are just slightly on the clutch at all, it will not stall. It'll chug, chug, chug. And then it has all of this really usable torque in that enduro map too. I guess one of my favorite tests on the YZ250X that I had was when I put the flywheel weight on it in the smart carb and seeing if it could just pull itself along without any throttle. That is pretty crazy, guys. No throttle at all. I'll probably be running the enduro map most of the time in the race because I know it's going to be kind of tighter single track racing on the Oracle race of AMRA. But it'll be really nice to know that if I do get a really big straight with some big whoops, I can just throw it in the power map mode and just skim right across the top of those between the combination of the power and the suspension on this bike now. So the GET ECU and these other power mods are definitely another big favorite on this bike. Another mod that I really like putting on this bike and really have enjoyed overall is this Gear Mako 360 handlebar mount. It basically makes it so the handlebars are not touching any metal at all in how they're mounted. It's all rubber contact. And what that did is it just got rid of all of the vibration in the handlebars. These big 4-strokes do vibrate a lot, and what that does is it makes you kind of grab a little bit more, and it also causes a lot of arm pump because your forearms are shaking a lot. And so doing that actually got rid of a lot of that arm pump that's normally associated with a big 500 like this. And overall, it's a very smooth bike for a big bore 4-stroke, but it is much better with this Mako 360. And this particular Mako 360 also has a Scott steering stabilizer on the bottom. In these very, very, very loose, rocky scenarios that we have here in Arizona, our single track here is like mostly you're riding on baby heads or rock with like little kind of interwoven sand moments. I really like the Scott steering stabilizer. It keeps the front end stable and allows you just to relax, and you won't get those like really hard twists where the front end just kind of knocks its way out. It'll keep it straight while you're plowing through a bunch of garbage rock. So that handlebar setup is phenomenal. And I'm still running the stock bars from the moment, and then I've just got some Cycra wraparound handguards. The only other functional mod that I have on the bike, other than the tubeless system, so that both tires are tubeless right now, it's just re-geared. It's got a +2 rear tooth sprocket for a little bit more low end, make it so that I don't have to go down into first gear ever for any type of single track riding. This bike is always in second gear, and I'm mostly going between second and third for single track riding. Now, I don't know how that's gonna play out with adventure style riding. I might have to go back to the stock gearing on the adventure style riding so that the thing is not ringing itself out on 65 mile an hour, 70 mile an hour roads. And that's it pretty much for the big mods. Everything else that's on this bike is just normal protection stuff, and it's not necessarily stuff that you need 100%, right? Like I've got a rear disc guard protection. It's the Bulletproof Designs rear disc guard. As you can see, that has 40 hours on it and it is shaved. The corners are shaved off, so I'm glad I have it because that would have been my disc otherwise. But not everybody that runs one of these bikes is running in the type of rocky terrain that we have here in Arizona. If you're in the East Coast where it's not as rocky, where it's more like roots and mud, then maybe you don't need that. And also, I've got this very, very big SXS skid plate that has been hit a few times really, really hard on some rocks here and takes the beating. So that was, very good too. But there's a ton of different skid plate options out there that would be just as good depending on your riding style. The only other thing too is these Fastway dropped foot pegs. I'm 6'1", and I find that it sinks me into the bike a little bit more, which allows me to pinch right here on the bike versus up here on the narrower part of the seat with my knees. So I like to do the drop pegs. But other than that, it is just a regular 500 XCF-w. And I know that sounds ridiculous because we went through a lot of mods there, but it's not like it's a completely worked bike. It is suspension, power, and protection, and handlebars. That's it. It did already have this Acerbis VSL headlight on it, which is really, really good. I don't think it's gonna be good enough for adventure style riding, but it's great for single track riding and having to get home at night, which is awesome. But I think for the adventure setup, I'll probably do something a little bit different. So it'll be really interesting to see how I do on this bike in a race in AMRA coming up in the B class. Because I think most of the people that I'll probably be racing against will be on 300 2-strokes, 250 2-strokes, and we'll probably have, some more of those closed course competition 4-strokes like the XCFs. I don't think we'll see a lot of XCF-Ws there, which would be kind of fun. So it'd be really interesting to see how this bike does and how I do against some of those folks. Now, to make this thing an adventure bike, what are we gonna have to do to it? I don't think it's impossible. Even if you are just looking for a bike for single track riding and you like 4-strokes, this 500 XCF-w is fantastic. The 2016 version of the 500 EXC, as far as like reliability goes, there's a guy named Adam Reineman, and he has done over 75,000 adventure miles on one of these 500 EXCs. There's another guy named Round the World Paul. So these bikes are actually really good as long-term travel bikes. And I know for a fact from one of my buddies that does oil testing on his Adventure 500 EXC that the oil is good for 40 to 60 hours of riding. So essentially you can get a 5 to 6 day adventure ride out of one of these bikes without having to change the oil. So pretty cool stuff, but it all depends on how you ride. If you're gonna be beating on the bike the whole time while you're doing adventure style riding, like maybe you're doing Mexico adventure style riding and following the Baja course, well then maybe you wanna change that oil a little bit sooner. All right, thank you so much for watching this episode of Source ADV. Make sure to subscribe below if you wanna see me race this thing and do some adventures on it and just see how well it does overall as a do it all bike. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, go down below, all good. And thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the ride.